history of our country is characterized by too much forgetting.
It was Winnie Mandela and not Mandela's wife.
An explosion in South Africa that would make the French Revolution look like a very early morning picnic.
Southern Africa is like a zebra. You cannot put a bullet in the white stripe and think the animal will not die. It will die.
It has become difficult to avoid taking lives.
Many people look at the making of the modern South Africa as a modern miracle. This was no miracle. This was about a unique breed of people being at the same place at the same time and finding each other at a human level.
In the ensuing years, since our democracy, many of us might not know of all the backstories that actually led to us having this great free democracy. In 1990, Nelson Mandela, following his release from prison, landed here at Kaunda International Airport in Lusaka, Zambia. To a rousing reception, one that would make the grandest popstar green with envy, he was received by Zambians, South Africans, and Africans alike.
When Mandela was freed, he found a whole crowd of us there waiting for him, and it was all an excitement. The whole of that afternoon, the streets were lined with people, and there was a euphoria all over Southern Africa.
I was there that day, the day he landed, just on the other side of this building, standing at attention on the tarmac, fighting to will my 10-year-old body to be still as it trembled with excitement, as I and the fellow pioneers standing beside me received our leaders, the architects of our freedom, and our future president. We cheered and ululated when he stood at the podium, but not before we ululated for the presidents of each frontline state and every liberation movement.
I am happy to be on Zambian soil because this is the country, and of course there are others, but this is the country which has made it possible for us to continue our struggles.
The Frontline states, Angola, Botswana, Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique, allies in a present and future war. Lusaka, Zambia, the diplomatic capital of the Frontline states. It is here that the diplomatic wars of Southern Africa are being waged. In the center of these intrigues, the president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda. He is one of the field marshals in Black Africa's war on white rule.
Unless we remove the root cause of the dangers of the situation that exists today in Southern Africa, we are going to be confronted by an explosion in South Africa that would make the French Revolution look like a very early morning picnic.
They developed a coalition in this region of Southern Africa, a coalition between independent states and the liberation movements, all of whom agreed that we have got a common task of ensuring the liberation of the unliberated countries. And we have got, therefore, a responsibility to cooperate and coordinate among ourselves and support one another.
Quanto a esta questão, os países da linha da frente, quando se reunissem, tinham um programa, tinham uma agenda. Era a luta contra o apartheid e a independência. E, portanto, aí não havia nenhum conflito. Não havia nenhum conflito porque o inimigo estava determinado. O inimigo estava determinado, que era a África do Sul.
While most African countries were celebrating their independence, South Africa was steadily becoming more repressive towards her own people.
Dad was the Secretary General of the African National Congress during its, difficult period, even, going underground. And I had been detained because they wanted to get information about my father. My mother was also detained. I was the youngest detainee at the time. So when I was detained, my mom did indicate that, it's a vicious system, you might be arrested.
I became active in the struggle in 1953. At that time, repression began to increase to a point that was reached in 1960 after Sharpeville, that it appeared that non-violent means on their own would not suffice. But I also grew up with the view that I believed that the ends justified any means. But I had a rude awakening when I was in prison and through my discussions with Walter Sisulu. In prison, Walter took me on and said to me, Mac, you are not understanding the problem. There are two struggles. One is the larger struggle of overthrowing apartheid. But in order to overthrow apartheid, there is a second struggle to create the organization capable of leading that struggle to overthrow apartheid. And he says that's another struggle. You have to struggle within your organization to make it into that instrument.
The ANC decided that now is the time to move from non-violent protest to active struggle, including violence. If the police shoot, we shoot back. So it was a different phase. And therefore, for the apartheid regime, it was a much more dangerous phase because they were now going to meet with people who were prepared to die for their beliefs.
On the night of Sharpeville, which was March 21st, Walter Sisulu, the Secretary General of the ANC, asked me to leave the country immediately because prior to that, I had been asked if I would assist Oliver Tambo to go out of the country. So I went on to Salisbury, as it then was, and tried to arrange for the exit of Oliver Tambo to Tanzania, which was the nearest country where they could find, I hoped, asylum. I sent a very tiny plane to an airport or an airstrip in the northern Botswana. When I say airstrip, the pilot warned me to tell the people that if there were elephants on that strip, they should stay on the side and he would buzz the airstrip until the elephants left. Only after that would he land. And that was the beginning of the external mission of the ANC being established.
I knew I had to leave the country. There was no way I could continue to stay in the country and not be arrested. You don't know where you're going. I was given just a bit of pocket money. You know, I had a small little bag, but clearly as a student, I of course put in a few books so that if I'm asked, I'll say, well, you know, I'm a student, I'm doing this and that. And I wasn't very keen on leaving. I was a bit late for the appointment. But the old man was waiting for me. He said, no, I know, I told you it's 7 o'clock, but the train leaves at 8. So,
They just came to tell me that you are leaving the country. I said, no, I can't. I have 3 children. They said, so what? But about these other people who have been killed, how many children did they have? I got such a shock. I told him, no, that's not fair. The other people have children too, but they are men. I'm a woman. He says, all the reason why you should go. We need people, and we need you. I said, all right, I'll see what I can do, but I don't know what I'll say to my mother because I've got to leave the children with her. And I told her that, you know, the organization is sending me to school. So she agreed to remain. How long are you going away? I said, for a year. I left. I was away for 27 years.
We walked as school kids. We must have been between 10 and 15. We walked on foot from Mafikeng one night and crossed into Botswana. The patrols along the borders spotted us and they started shooting. When we were already on the Botswana side, and then there was this nice altercation between the Botswana, Maponisa, and the South African ones, with the South Africans saying, hand them over, they are terrorists. And Botswana looking at us says, no, these are kids.
we had to register as refugees. And somebody was waiting for us there and then took us at night to some refugee camp. The people from Zimbabwe, Swapo from Namibia, we were all young, we were all raring to go, we all wanted to get military training, we all wanted to go back home.
I called myself the ANC's travel agent because I was then in Dar es Salaam and arranging for the movement of the senior leaders in and out of South Africa because it had to be done clandestinely. Externally, the main person, of course, was Oliver Tambo, because almost the entire leadership in the country who hadn't got out had been imprisoned.
Once across South Africa's borders, the exiles eventually went everywhere. They moved into the frontline states and beyond: Tanzania, Angola, Europe, America, and Asia. They were scattered to the winds.
The movement at that point was also, I suppose, planning for its own future. People were encouraged to acquire certain skills, military skills, and then there were others who were, I suppose, earmarked to acquire other sorts of skills so that you might be able to run a government at some point. people like myself were more or less designated as they won't do the fighting, they'll do the writing and the talking and the governing.
We were all assigned tasks, each individual, and the starting point was to empower each individual. To carry out a task, you must be empowered. We even sent youngsters, or some of them became pilots, who didn't have an Air Force. But hey, we knew we were going to have a country. So we did military training, and did mine in Russia. And so we had to do military training in winter in the snow. And a lot of us hadn't seen the snow before.
I met Max Sisulu, who later became my husband, at the Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands. And so he came for this meeting and he was quite serious. And I think the connection of Southern Africans meeting away from home, that's what was interesting about meeting. When we first spoke, I knew who Walter Sisulu was, and I knew this. So it was interesting to meet his son.
My earliest memory of seeing my grandfather's face was on a calendar that was on the wall in the small apartment that I shared with my mom in Leipzig, Germany. I was born there, but I wasn't German. I didn't feel German, even as I spent my formative years there. I was in another country. It was a country called exile.
I left for exile because they wanted to assassinate me. And of course, when we were operating in Mozambique, our unit survived twice, attacks on the border. Several times they shot at our 4x4s. So the risks were living with you every day. But you have, as a revolutionary, to invest in the risk to see the opportunity beyond it.
The South African government had to clean the region, cleanse it of any possibility that the ANC could use these countries to conduct the struggle. There was somebody that was sent from here who was a New Zealander. He must have been some kind of mercenary, who was sent, for instance, to assassinate me in Lusaka. I mean, this was a matter that we lived with wherever we were. Because it was not in Botswana, in Lesotho, in Swaziland, it was a killing of our people. And it was not just attacks on us, but also attacks on these states that were friendly to us.
Look at the ANC leadership outside the country. Look at the number of ANC leaders that have been assassinated. I don't think the South African regime would resort to those sorts of measures if they thought that the ANC leadership was nicely tucked away in a Sheraton hotel, eating nicely, not bothering them.
Often you would hear of explosions at different offices, whether they were of the ANC or of the PAC and other liberation movements. Once as a child, I remember us having to crawl nightly across the street into our neighbors' yards and to sleep on our neighbors' floor because someone had seen a random chap that no one recognized pointing at our houses.
As we were sitting lunchtime sorting out the mail, I was also with a friend of mine who worked with me called Matata. And so we opened this parcel and it exploded. Died on the spot. My friend was banned. I also nearly died. My left eardrum was damaged even today. We were fortunate to survive because the office where we were was prefab. Had it been concrete, would have all died.
It was dangerous. Conditions were very, very harsh. We stood in line for rations of bread, of rice, of cooking oil. We could buy fish from the market and so on. We worked very long hours, from early morning to late at night. I had to learn the Portuguese language, and it was an exhilarating and at times baffling and difficult, strenuous, frustrating period for me. And suddenly one day, I'm going to the beach to relax a little bit, and boom.
I received a phone call from Ruth First, passing through London, to say she'd heard of the birth of our son. She wanted to congratulate us. There was no time to stop to see me. We would meet in Maputo. That was my last conversation with Ruth First. She arrived in Maputo. She was in an office. She received a parcel. She opened it, and it blew up. And Ruth First was pieces of flesh stuck on the walls.
They use everything. They use poison, they use direct assassination. So for a regime that is fighting for its survival, they use anything and everything.
Each frontline state, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, had command structures. And each one of us as commanders, we had cells inside the country we've established. We were seeing people from inside the country every day. They were coming out for fresh instructions and to brief us. And we briefed them back. We didn't respect the borders. We crossed the borders all the time.
I then was entrusted with the task of intercepting a train carrying these conscriptees going to Hoedspruit. And I came to the conclusion that if I put a bomb, a series of bombs, on a bend at a cliff, I would bring that train straight down into the ravine. All that was left was how you were going to mop up the operation and escape safely. We did all the reconnaissance for that. We were ready to strike. Oliver sent a message to me nearing D-Day to say, think again, shouldn't we call off this operation? And I wrote back and said, too late. A military operation, once it is in motion, cannot be switched on and off as you wish. In the meantime, I am going through a crisis inside myself. The tension as we are approaching D-Day has led to my hands breaking out into blisters and sores that covered both hands. As it happened, we missed that train by just a few hours. And I returned to Maputo without anybody getting wind that that was the operation we had planned. And we would have wiped off 700 young conscriptees minimum in that train load. It would have been one of the most dramatic events in South Africa.
For the people at the time back home, they knew that even if you died in the struggle for freedom, you remained a hero, you had a decent burial, and the parents of young people, most of us were young at the time, who died, of course, distraught, upset, but it's not as though they themselves were having any easier life, because terror continued in South Africa.
From 1,000 miles away, the voice of Thabo Mbeki drifts over the airwaves.
We have to make apartheid unworkable and our country ungovernable. For months, we have maintained an uninterrupted offensive against the puppet local government authorities.
Back in Zambia, Thabo Mbeki and the others are waiting and hoping and remembering, and it is as much their past as it is their future that drives them.
Radio Freedom was like having a mass meeting inside the country, just as you would use mass meetings to communicate a message and to mobilize people and to galvanize people into action and to motivate them. So too, Radio Freedom had to serve, that purpose.
Every song had a meaning. My favorite song was Pasopa Fervut. And later on, it was Pasopa Foster. The song was saying to Foster, watch out, Mkhonto is coming. So it was, oh, Pasopa, Pasopa, Pasopa Foster. Nanku Mkhonto sofikile. And every one of those songs would be heard by the people here at home via Radio Freedom. So these songs created a link. Whereas they served also to boost our morale there, it also said to the comrades inside who were struggling under even more difficulties than we were, that we were still one.
The voice of the African National Congress, South Africa's time-tested revolutionary movement, born of the people into the front line, to spearhead the people's struggle for the seizure of power from the oppressors, a product of the battles of the African continent for liberation.
We could only judge the success or failure of Radio Freedom by the intake from inside the country. If people knew the freedom songs that we played on Radio Freedom, which didn't originate inside the country but came from outside, that meant that we were reaching this target audience and they were listening to these songs and they'd absorbed them and they had been inspired by them.
Soweto riots are not an isolated incident. As a matter of fact, we don't even regard them as Soweto riots as such, but a national disaster. It is the beginning of what we have always warned the nationalist, racist government about.
It was the Sharpeville massacre that first set in motion the exodus out of South Africa. But after the Soweto uprising in 1976, school children crossed the border in record numbers.
Each day, more and more people arrive from South Africa to join the ANC in an exodus that has been going on since Mbeki and the others fled. Some go to schools the ANC has established in other countries like Tanzania. They pursue college preparatory courses as well as training in guerrilla warfare.
Let me tell you about a little boy who came out of South Africa after 1976. At that time, a lot of young people came out. We think he was 8 or 9, who had come to the border and said, I want the ANC army. And he said to me, he says, you don't understand. Mama, you don't understand. And I said, what don't? He said, I want to fight. I want to go home. Now that was a very tremendous reflection of the spirit of those young people. Needless to say, he wasn't put into the army, he went to the school, but protested.
I remember being a kid and going to the cultural events, the marches, the music. All of that was part of the role that those in exile were playing. Mine, for instance, was teaching German to all of the MK soldiers that were coming to study in Germany. They said I was a precocious little guy that understood the language well. And they said, go to Shaka, have no fear. He'll talk with you and he'll make it easy for you to learn.
Being in those military camps actually provided me the chance to even learn how to cook. I'm not a very good cook, but hell, if you have cooked for more than 500 people at one go, you're a good cook, and they don't get sick. Right? Done. But all in all, the most important thing, other than teaching me how to use an AK-47, how to make bombs, it was also how to lead. We have known that what the leadership taught us, you must be prepared to lay down your life for your comrades and your people.
It has become difficult to avoid taking lives. That is because of the level of the struggle that has reached.
And our cadres were understood that it is the politics that drive the bullets and not the bullets driving the politics. So they understood that, the very advanced intellectual to understand what we stand for, and chose carefully military targets.
The authorities here describe the bomb attack, the worst in the country's history, as an act of communist warfare, and immediately held the banned African National Congress responsible. If this was the work of the ANC, it's their boldest attack to date and demonstrates the organization's determination to carry the guerrilla war to South Africa's major city centers.
My feelings on our targets were very clear. Oliver Tambo was at the lead of it. Church Street bomb, we accepted as legitimate. It was outside the headquarters of the South African Air Force. Yes, it killed civilians, but I think out of those 19, it was established that 11 were working for the Air Force in one capacity or another. We knew that there would be civilians, but we thought that those civilians were inevitably a presence by the South African Air Force putting its headquarters in Church Street. It left us with no option but to hit it in the context where some civilians would die.
As the struggle went on, the South Africans became mean and became very punitive and tried to force every country around them to toe the line.
This was a period when South Africa waged war, the apartheid regime waged war right across southern Africa. Troops were crossing illegally. They'd gone illegally into Angola.
These countries, instead of using the few resources available to build schools, hospitals, water systems and so on, they have to put a lot of money to build military capacity. That's why we have to go to international forums to request that this is no longer frontline state conflict, frontline war. This is beyond the frontline states. This belongs to Africa.
Because of the overwhelming military might of South Africa, the frontline states were sometimes forced into compromises. One such was the Nkomati Accord, which stipulated that the South African government would stop its incursions into Mozambique if President Machel would throw out the liberation movements. With the country in tatters and war looming on all sides, Machel had no choice but to sign.
When we came to the signing of the agreement in Nkomati, there was a big celebration. There were tables where we were sitting, white and black people invited to the feast, eating, commemorating, smiling, and even singing. When the so-called Marxist Samora Machel, with the apartheid regime head of state, had to inspect the guard of honor. On the South African side, all white soldiers paying respect to the black president, and he would go and bow to the flag of apartheid. That was a very emotional thing.
We knew that it was difficult for them to sacrifice for our cause because the Afrikaners were hitting them just as much as they were oppressing us. It was nothing for us to wake up to news to the effect that, oh, they raided in the neighboring states. And we felt that in some instances, our cadres were not well protected. And then we felt responsible in the sense that it was our people who went to seek refuge in those countries.
In the wake of South Africa's bombing raids on 3 neighboring countries yesterday, the Afrikaner Daily Beeld had harsh words for Zambia, one of the victims of the South African raids.
President Kaunda pretends to be the grand peacemaker of Africa while he harbours the headquarters of the ANC, from where probably most of the attacks against South Africa are planned. What did he expect?
But Mr. President, what do you now do? How are you going to convince Mrs. Thatcher now?
What is required to be done, it must be done by the international community. And in this respect, I am referring to mandatory economic sanctions. At least with sanctions, there will be less bloodshed. Whereas if you allow this thing to explode, the political volcano is going to engulf the whole area here. I am warning the rest of the world that we are going to lose hundreds of thousands of lives.
When we're going to hold a Commonwealth Summit in Osaka, Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister of Britain, we knew that she would be very uneasy. So we decided that we would organize a dancing evening. So music was played, I got up, she got up. We were moving. That's how she became my dancing partner.
So when you were dancing, I mean, did she try and sway you or take the lead and lead you towards the West in their proxy wars against the East?
No, she was very careful. She danced very well, innocently.
Margaret Thatcher was outrageous in my view. I mean, very outrageous. I mean, she was in the forefront of that phase which said, you are terrorists. And with a choir with Ronald Reagan, you are terrorists. But we accepted that some will work with us, others won't. There are those who work with us and work with the regime as well.
The complicated geopolitics of West versus East, capitalism versus communism, influenced the African continent and, of course, affected the exiles in their places of refuge. As a kid, there were a lot of American movies, and we were always told, look at the narrative. You know, the bad guys were always the Russians. But I knew the Russians. I'd met the Russians. The Russians had taken care of us. The Russians had fed us. In fact, when I was a kid, I was brought up on Russian propaganda about how the Russians were so great, about how they were the reason that the Second World War had ended. So who were the good guys? And who were the bad guys? I began to realize how public perception can be manipulated and how media was an ideological battleground all on its own.
The apartheid regime casted us in the mold of people who represented the interests of the East and not the West. And the whole propaganda machine was, well, let's stop these terrorists. Let's stop these communists who are spreading a strange ideology from far away into the region, into the continent. But this was manipulated as if the communists are driving these non-thinking Africans.
Apartheid was not what it was on its own. South Africa was supported by the West. It had all the arms it needed. It had everything it needed because the West saw South Africa as an important strategic place for itself.
In portanto, um cenário de guerra permanente entre Angola e a África do Sul. Angola viu-se obrigada a defender-se e a lutar contra o colonialismo e a lutar contra o apartheid e precisava dessa ajuda dos países socialistas, nomeadamente de Cuba e da União Soviética.
Angola. It was not South African territory, but they went to Angola in order to try and to reverse the irreversible tide of liberation. So going to war in Angola to support UNITA was in a sense to try and hold the war in Namibia. And so that war, of course, was a war they could never win. So there had to be some negotiations around it.
The negotiations included prying Namibia from the clutches of South Africa, who for decades had been holding on to it as a buffer zone to keep communism at bay. Therefore, stopping South Africa's aggression in Angola was inextricably linked with Namibia's own war of independence.
The freedom of the people of Namibia was not something that was given to them. They fought for it. But the important thing is that now it happened in the public domain. It was an international event. And South Africa didn't have the kind of strength to continue this war.
In 1988, the writing was on the wall, and South Africa was forced to sign United Nations Resolution 435, which demanded their withdrawal from Namibia and Angola.
A implementação da Resolução 435, 78 do Conselho de Segurança das Nações Unidas, também criaram condições para que a África do Sul, o governo racista da África do Sul, não voltasse a ocupar e a agredir Angola. Portanto, podemos dizer que foi graças a todo esse processo da implementação da 435, do esforço de Angola, da saída das forças cubanas de Angola, que se criaram as condições para a libertação de Nelson Mandela e para a libertação do regime do apartheid na própria África do Sul.
By now, the cracks in the National Party's strategy of total onslaught were beginning to show. The ongoing border wars were unpopular. The loss of international prestige and the strength of the ANC's support began to take its toll.
Here we are witnessing the beginning of the end of the apartheid system.
In 1989, we could see that it was inevitable that there would be negotiations to resolve the question of apartheid. And you might remember that the Security Council had approved what was called Resolution 435, which brought the UN into that process of sorting out the Namibian question. We wanted to avoid that because we were afraid that if you went the 435 route, then you'd get all sorts of countries coming into this, which would complicate the outcome here.
We always said we're our own liberators. And the solution that has to be the one that we agree to must be the one that involves us as people who shape their own future. The reason we were prepared to sacrifice our lives was not to sacrifice them in order for somebody to come with a solution that was not in our interest.
The document which became called the Harare Declaration was a Frontline State plus Liberation Movement's document. It was regional.
At the end, we needed the peace process in South Africa to be underwritten by African leaders, all of them. They encouraged the environment of discussions and the release of Mandela and the return of exiles. the release of political prisoners in South Africa. There was a momentum which did not start only in South Africa, but it was being pushed from all over the world.
After the Harare Declaration, expectations of returning home were at fever pitch, and political prisoners started being released. The struggle came full circle when upwards of 50,000 people from 35 host countries prepared to drive or fly home.
Foi uma vitória bastante grande para os países da linha da frente, que lutaram muito arduamente, que lutaram intensamente, que Nelson Mandela pudesse ser posto em liberdade. E também o próprio regime do apartheid fosse erradicado.
Had it not been their solidarity with us, I think the leadership would have died in prison.
Nelson Mandela came to Lusaka. Well, that was like something out of a book or a movie. It was a completely surreal experience. I've never experienced anything like that in my life, and I doubt I'd experience anything like that ever again. It was just unbelievable. For people who grew up with this dream, and it was like the dream is coming true at last.
So it was a great moment. Here is Nelson Mandela arriving, landing on Zambian soil. I thanked God. It was a great moment not for me, who am I? For Africa as a whole.
We went to State House and there were a whole lot of people in the room. And I remember Max took me in to meet him, and it was strange to meet Mandela and say, "Oh, Eleanor, how are you?" As if I'm a long lost friend. And he was just the epitome of charm and charisma. I confess that I was very worried when this Madiba, this whole Mandela mania was building up, that he would come out and disappoint us. But he really lived up to the legend.
Everybody else had Father Christmas. I had these heroes of the struggle. It's a bit of a surreal feeling because you hear about this person and you've gotten letters from them saying they love you, even though you haven't met. And oddly, even though you haven't met them, you love them. And you're in awe of them. And then you meet them and they're real.
It was not possible to despair because the spirit of the people outside was too great, and therefore that gave me confidence.
I hadn't seen my parents many, many years.
For how many years?
A lifetime for me. I had sons, I had a family that they hadn't seen.
It was then the first time when she got to meet her son Max, since he had left home at 17, and now he was a man in his 40s with children. Seeing each other physically for the first time was an experience. We just went wild, and it's just inexpressible. That kind of joy of reunion after so many decades, it's still something which kind of chokes me up to talk about it.
And my dad also was quite relaxed to be able to see his grandchildren. There was a time, I suspect, He might have felt he was not going to live to see them, all his grandchildren, but hey, he was able to see. It was a wonderful feeling for all of us.
An unbelievable feeling, actually, because for the first time in 30 years, there was not a single member of my family banned, detained, or in jail.
We believe that every square inch, and I still believe, every square inch of this world is mine as it is everybody else's. Everybody's struggle is my struggle for freedom.
Magnificent statue, isn't it? The African breaking his chains of bondage. This statue is called the Freedom Statue, and it can be found in the heart of Lusaka, Zambia. We enjoy our freedom because these frontline states joined together so we could be free, so we could come home, so we could be at home in our own country, finally.
Tiende pamozi timutima umo, tiende pamozi timutima umo.
Youth of Africa, the continent of Africa has plenty of problems. Poverty, hunger, ignorance, disease.
Now we're fighting AIDS. Timenye nkhondo ya AIDS ndi mtima umo. Timenye nkhondo ya AIDS ndi mtima umo. Timenye nkhondo ya AIDS ndi mtima umo. Timenye nkhondo ya AIDS ndi mtima.
Rise up and be counted. Make Africa what it should be.
Africa tiyeri mbamo. Timenye nkhondo ya AIDS ndi mtima umo.